countries across the world have experienced a strong rise in immigration of late. And this has, of course, widespread social, political, and economic effects, but I just want to focus on one narrow aspect, the impact on rents, and look at the implications for inflation and the prospects for interest rates. Now, in last week's Market Perspectives, I argued that the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England would all cut rates in June. This week, I suggest that rental inflation could limit the scale and pace of subsequent rate cuts, especially in the US. Now, it could have a similar effect in the UK, but smaller, and the European effect, Eurozone impact, smaller still. Now, economists differ on the impact of the effect of immigration on overall inflation, on wages and unemployment. After all, immigrants increase the supply of labour, but they also increase demand. There's one area, though, where I think the impact is unambiguous: rents. And in the US, rents matter a lot because they have a big weight, far too big in my opinion, in the indices. It's 35% in the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And immigration has surged in the US. The other category shown in this chart, it includes a lot of things, but it's dominated by unauthorised migrants. Now, by their very nature, statistics on these sort of things are tricky. But these numbers, they come from the highly regarded Congressional Budget Office. And they're big and rising rapidly to around 300,000 per month this year. Many of these migrants are encountered by the US Border Patrol, as they put it, then released into the community and can work after several months. Now, I'm guessing, presumably, that these migrants don't have the resources to pay as much for housing as existing US citizens, but they still increase demand, and their numbers are very large and presumably push rents higher. Now, recent inflation data in the US has been disappointing, and rents have been one of the big factors behind that. Rental inflation there is running at 6% a year and showing something of a tendency to accelerate, confounding many forecasters, including me, who expected the opposite. Now, the US CPI matters a great deal for inflation expectations, cost of livings, and so forth. Federal Reserve, though, they target a different measure, the Personal Consumption Expenditure Deflator. Bit of a mouthful. That has a much lower weight, 18% than the Consumer Price Index, but that's still a very big number. As other sources of inflation decline, the importance of rents, if they keep on increasing, would naturally become more and more important. Now, ultimately, rental supply in the US can increase to meet demand, but that takes time, many, many years. Now, let's hope the data on the CPI and wages out this week are more encouraging. But I'll also be paying attention to the glut of speakers from the Fed to see if any of them discuss this important topic. By the way, the reason that the weight of rents, or shelter as they call it in the US, is so much higher in the US is that they include owner's equivalent rent, which is what homeowners would pay if they rented from themselves. Sounds crazy? Well, I agree. In my view, it has no place in the measure of inflation. And by the way, virtually no other stats authorities in any other country take the same approach as the US. Here in the UK, we've also seen a strong rise in immigration, but unlike the US, the rise has been in legal immigration, or at any rate, those authorised to work. And we get a good idea of the scale from national insurance numbers issued to adults from overseas. These reached 1.1 million in 2022. At the time, I thought this was a one-off, a catch-up from COVID, but last year saw a similar 1.1 million increase. Now, these numbers are gross, and some of these migrants will have returned home, and there are other issues with the data, but I reckon they are more accurate than almost any of the stats in this area. Now, in the US, average rents here, they take time to catch up with the market for new tenancies. That's just the way the market works. And UK private rental inflation is running at 6%, much the same as in the US, but that big difference is the weight. Here in the UK, the weight in the CPI is just 8 percentage points, 1/4 of the US weight. So they matter less. But UK rental inflation is accelerating more rapidly here and the weight of our CPI is set to rise over the next few years. Now, there are many other factors besides migration work here in the UK, but overall the impact will be there, but smaller than in the US. The Eurozone has a similar weight on rents to the UK in their consumer price index, but rental inflation is much lower there. The market's very different. And things could change, but I reckon the impact on ECB policy and interest rates is pretty small. So what does all this mean? I still think inflation and interest rates are headed down. I still think that the big three central banks will all cut their rates by 0.25% in June, but the pace and scale of subsequent cuts in the US could well be smaller than I previously thought. We shall see. Until next week, goodbye.